for everyone joining us online. My name's Eve Patton. I'm Director of the Trinity Long Room Hub, which is Trinity's Research Institute for the Arts and Humanities. And I'm absolutely delighted that we're returning in person, as well as online this evening, for Behind the Headlines. Our Behind the Headlines series, which is supported by the John Pollard Foundation, had to move online, as did everything else during the pandemic. But coming back to it in person means a great deal. And I want to thank everyone for coming who's joining us here in the room. For those of you who are attending Behind the Headlines for the first time, this is an opportunity for us to come together to think about current headline issues and to bring to them insights that very often come from our own disciplines in the arts and humanities, and to ask experts in their fields to add their voices and perspectives. And this evening, in the aftermath of what seemed like a very long summer of environmental catastrophes across the world, and now as the mid-November temperatures here in Ireland threaten to reach the high teens, we're turning again to climate disaster. 2022 is the centenary year, as you know, of many things, but among them it is the centenary of T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land, that great long modernist poem that Eliot wrote after the devastation of the First World War and in the wake of the moral as well as physical collapse of, as he saw it, a former civilization. Eliot said that he would show us fear in a handful of dust. And what we want to do this evening is just to pick up some of his imagery 100 years on as a springboard to thinking about wastelands. Wastelands existing and in prospect in the context of climate crisis. This evening's panel is meeting, and we're coming together first of all against the backdrop of COP27, which, as you know, is taking place in Egypt without, I think, the kind of confidence that we would like to see in world leaders and their commitments. But it's also taking place amid calls for disciplines across the arts and humanities to engage yet further in responding to environmental disaster and to climate change. This is a crisis that puts urgent demands not just on science, politics, but on the creative imagination and on language itself. Are the very terms that we use, horror, disaster, apocalypse, mobilizing us to action, or are they in fact in danger of distancing us further from the conditions that we're actually trying to confront? These are some of the questions that we're going to be following tonight, and I won't spend any more time talking. Let me turn to our panel and introduce them to you. As you know, if you followed Behind the Headlines before, they have a punitive 10 minutes to speak before we open to questions. And we're joined this evening, I'm pleased to say, and I'm going to introduce them to you in the order that they'll be speaking. First of all, by Neasa Hardiman, who's here. Neasa is an award-winning Irish filmmaker. She has a PhD from Trinity in film theory, and she has degrees from NCAD, the National College of Art and Design, and from Berlin's Universität der Kunst. She's written and directed original theatre, creative documentaries, and many globally screened dramas and films, and she's been awarded both at the IFTAs, the Irish Film and Television Awards, and at BAFTA. Her award-winning feature film, which I know some of you will have seen, is Sea Fever. And she's going to be talking about this film this evening. Sea Fever debuted on the opening night of the 2019 Toronto International Film Festival, and after that it was distributed worldwide. I have seen it, and I don't want to say any more about it because Neasa will talk to you a little bit about it and why it's placed here tonight in the context of our discussions. But I know from having seen it, it raises questions that are right to the fore of what we want to think about this evening. Our second speaker is Conor Brennan. And Conor is a PhD candidate finishing his PhD in Trinity's Department of German. His research compares aesthetic responses to climate crisis across a range of contemporary fiction, but he also looks back to the influence of modernist authors such as Franz Kafka and their influence on the contemporary landscape. He has a BA in German and English from Trinity, a master's in German from the University of Oxford, and he was an Ertegun scholar, in fact, at Oxford. And having heard Conor speak on this subject and on his research previously, I'm really looking forward to hearing his contribution this evening. My colleague Cathriona Russell, at the end of the panel, lectures in the School of Religion, Theology and Peace Studies in Trinity, and her work focuses on environmental theology and philosophy, cosmology and creation, technology, agricultural and research ethics, and theories of justice in sustainable development. She's been many things in the years that she spent before coming to Trinity, including studying agricultural science at UCD, and she has also worked in ecosystem monitoring and in commercial horticulture, working as a nursery plants person and gardener, experience which of course also I think is relevant in many ways to some of our considerations today. And our final speaker on the panel is Yairen Jerez Columbié, who is an assistant professor in Latin American studies and intercultural communication in Trinity. Yairen grew up in Havana, in Cuba, and has taught in universities in Spain and in Ireland. She's also a published writer. She writes in Cuban Spanish, in English, and Catalan. And I want to congratulate her because her first poetry collection, which translates as Fossilized Rain, and I hope she'll hold it up for us, was just being published. It was published this year, partly through a Trinity College Dublin Association and Trust grant. A very beautiful piece of work. But Yairen is also the author of a volume of essays on transculturation and Catalan-Cuban intellectual history, which was published last year, and co-editor of an open access edited volume, Creating Resilient Futures, Integrating Disaster Risk Reduction, Sustainable Development Goals, and Climate Change Adaptation Agendas. And that was just published this year, Yairen, by Palgrave. And I know we'll be able to get a link, I think, for you for that if you're interested. Yairen also brings a particular experience to Trinity. Before coming to the college, she worked in interdisciplinary research at the SFI Science Foundation Ireland Centre for Energy, Climate and Marine Research and Innovation. So another perspective that's highly relevant to some of the things we're going to be talking about this evening around the subject of wastelands. So that's our panel. They will speak for 10 minutes and then we'll move to some discussion, some comments from you, some Q&A. So with that, I'm going to hand over first to you, Neasa, and I know you have some visuals for us. So bear with us in the audience if it takes a few seconds just to get this set up.
I'm going to play the trailer of the movie. So if you haven't seen it, you'll feel like you've seen it. Oh, I should still remember that. Super.
You're the scientist, I hear.
I am Jared, the skipper. This is Freya,
the real boss.
What is your work while you're on board?
I identify and extrapolate patterns from variations in deep sea behaviour. I need to photograph your catch.
Yes!
We're on a roll.
Something's wrong.
What is that? How long till they eat through the bowl?
That's inside the boat. vulnerable to get infected.
I can't see.
I want you to test all of us.
Those things will spread really fast. We need to quarantine ourselves.
We're making port tonight.
But you don't understand.
They cannot hear me! Forsaken.
Right then. So that's the end of my talk. I hope you enjoyed that. It's basically, I'm going to just talk to you very briefly about the film and why I was trying to make a film that, what my intentions were in making it. I'm going to give you a very brief outline of the story. I'm going to talk really more about the themes that are in the film and characterization as an embodiment of those themes. So the overall intention, this is the sound mix when we were putting the sound mix together, which is this infra sound, which you can only hear in the cinema with these huge big speakers that give you, you know, that like a sonic boom, if you've ever heard thunder going by, you feel it down here, gives you a sense of scale, so we're trying to deliver that. What I wanted to do really was make a film of ideas that would use the language of cinema, which is essentially, as we know, the language of dreams, right? To articulate in a meaningful way some of the thinking that relates to our ecological crisis by means of finding a kind of cinematic correlative for that. So I didn't want to make a disaster movie because that's what you're talking about, results when you're talking about a disaster movie. I wanted to dramatise the kind of the central modes of imagining and thinking that have led us to this kind of ecological crisis. And I wanted to do that in a way that what I was trying to do was to try to get under people's skin, just to reach beyond preconceptions and political positions and ideologies and try to create something that has that kind of oniric, potent reflectivity that's about ways of thinking but using a kind of haptic sensory language that goes with a dream reality. So that's sort of the intention. And so drawing on a kind of German expressionism, because like yourself, I have a great immersion in German visual culture, and I was very interested in that kind of German expressionist way of trying to articulate the unease and disturbance in the air that was happening coming up to the Second World War, and to try to use that same kind of unease, using the same kind of dream imagery, not the same imagery, but the same approach to dream imagery, the same kind of approach to sort of an oniric sense of unease that you find in those early German films, to make something that would feel intimate, that would feel personal, and that would have an uncanny sense to it that didn't get manufactured, like a sudden unexpected noise. So really, that was the intention, and the intention with this thing. This is the animal that's in the film. So I've just spoiled the story for you because it doesn't turn up until the third act. But the intention really was to create something where I was trying to evoke in the audience a kind of a sense of wonder that the thing itself, it sort of pulses with this blue-green light. It's quite lovely to look at. It's got this quality of wonder to it, but also the scale of it. There's something kind of dreadful about the scale. And the intention there was to evoke the same kinds of feelings that you get when you're faced with the natural world. So the central ambition really was to try to dramatise and concretise this sort of feeling of dread and wonder around the natural world, and then to dramatise the conflict between the ecological and the economic interests that have caused us to land in this crisis, and how easily that we all fall into a kind of anthropocentrism, and then to discuss, the problems with how our approach to ecology is damaged by our prioritising of the economic. So I wanted to disestablish in that context the kinds of cultural representations that are often encoded in Hollywood cinema, because they tend to kind of reinforce and reproduce certain kinds of thinking and certain kinds of imagining. But at the same time as wanting to disestablish those forms of thinking, I wanted to engage people in the way that the pleasures of Hollywood cinema kind of engage people. So I felt that it was important to have that kind of incredibly propulsive narrative construction and really dynamic character transformation. And also to make something that didn't feel tendentious or propagandist. I think the risk for me in terms of making a film like this was that you can end up preaching to the choir. You can end up screening at a lot of film festivals and screening at a lot of climate crisis conferences. And I really didn't want to do that. I wanted this film to screen at multiplexes. What's the point of making a film where you're raising these issues and trying to think about different ways of imagining the world, unless you can screen at multiplexes, unless you can sneak into people's unprepared consciousness, unless you can bypass political resistances or semantic polarities that people are familiar with and feel that they already have taken a position on, and meet mainstream audiences really where they are, while at the same time not compromising those and collapsing into those semantic polarities. So narratively then, what I wanted was this propulsive narrative drive. So I knew I needed a grounded, this is sounding again, really realist world. So I structured the film as a really contained narrative, and it takes place in this completely closed world of this trawler, which is a real trawler that fishes out of Russell. And in the story it's marooned 5 days journey out into the Atlantic. And the nice thing that gives us is two kinds of wasteland in a certain way, because when you're out in the Atlantic and it's very calm, there's a quality of the desert to it. You know, there's nothing. You can't drink the water, there's nothing visible on the surface. And it gives you a kind of agoraphobia, or it gives me a kind of agoraphobia. But at the same time, there's a claustrophobia attached to being in this. You can see the size of the boat there, it's about 80 foot long, and it's made of wood and steel. And that's it, that's your whole world. You're not going anywhere else until that gets back to land. So there's something nice and contained about that. And the trawler in the story, it encounters the aftermath of bottom trawling, and bottom trawling is it's an act of greed, and it's also an act of desperation. It's a technique that, I'm sure a lot of you know this already, it basically drags a very narrow mesh net across the sea floor, so it kills absolutely everything on the sea floor. It's incredibly destructive, and it's illegal, but people still do it. And they do it right down to the Hadal Zone, you know, which is really deep water. We don't know what's down there. Like, we're destroying things that we haven't even had an opportunity to understand or study. There are innumerable life forms that get pulled up through this process, that because they live at such intense pressures, when you pull them up to the surface, you don't even know who they are, because their bodies just disintegrate at surface pressure. So it makes the tragedy of the destruction even more profound, that we're destroying worlds that we have no idea what they are. So I constructed then in this bottom trawling as something, as an act whereby something is disturbed, which is not beyond the beyonds. So the idea was something whose scale and body design would be consonant with what we know to be true. In other words, that if you live at that level, if you're an animal that lives at that level, that your body can actually grow to quite a big scale, because you don't have to have very heavy muscles and bones to survive. You can float. And those animals are not tetrapodal the way we are. They're not built on a kind of 2 arms, 2 legs, or 4 legs, or whatever. And so it's very difficult to anthropomorphize those animals in the way that we might anthropomorphize other mammals, or even other land animals that are vertebrates in the way that we are. So the animal, what I wanted to do was to kind of challenge any kind of anthropocentric perspective. You know, it's in its own habitat. The film's figures are the intruders into this habitat, and it's, you know, unengageable, if you like, with us, and it has no kind of interest in us. So its danger to us is incidental rather than malevolent. And it was also important to me that it be really beautiful and have that quality of, when you see something extraordinary in the natural world, there's something that happens within you, something that's about awe and wonder and dread all at the same time. You're confronted with your own insignificance, as it were, at the same time as feeling this wonder and beauty. So I told the story from the perspective of this figure here, who's played by Hermione Corfield, and she's a young scientist on the trawler, and she's kind of a Cassandra figure, which you have to have if you're telling a story about climate crisis, right? So she's struggling to communicate what it is that she observes and deduces from the disturbance of this animal before the other crew members really understand that this is not an economic opportunity, that this is a different kind of crisis. And then in keeping with popular and media relations to contemporary climate scientists, the crew, who are the world of this story, ask her to be a lot more charming in terms of her warnings. Ask her then, when they start to develop a little bit more of an imagining and an understanding of what's going on, to be omniscient in terms of what's going to happen next, and if she gets it slightly wrong, then it's proof that she was wrong all along. And ask her then, as things get even worse, to provide magical solutions in the way that science is asked to provide magical solutions. And it gives me an opportunity to articulate the kind of themes that I wanted to unfold in the story that are interwoven in the kind of crisis that we've allowed ourselves to get into. The first is, of course, that we have this advantage of having the world in microcosm in this small community. So it's peopled in the story by an equal number of men and women, which is completely untrue, actually, of the world of trawler fishing. It's incredibly patriarchal. There are really, really, really few women on the boats. In fact, the research that I did for this film, I did with the one female skipper in Ireland, who is now retired, so now there are no female skippers in Ireland. But what is true is that the boats are home, this scale of boat, this kind of 80-footer, 60-footer, they're homes to indigenous people whose traditions are eroding in the face of big industrial boats that just hoover up everything and destroy ecosystems. And also, they're being destroyed, or their traditional modes of fishing are being destroyed by increasing pollution that destroys any kind of shallow sea fishing, that those fishing beds are all really depleted because the shallower waters off our shores are so poorly managed. And it's also true that those boats are home to migrant people who are fleeing the result of war and or colonial exploitation. And you get a lot of migrant people working on those boats as well. So one of the big themes of the story, obviously, is economic versus ecological crisis, or economic versus ecological precarity. And that can be articulated, and is articulated in the story by means of this idea of the conflict between individual need, which is desperate among these people, and global need. So you can equate that to all kinds of indigenous peoples across the world, and how individual economic need butts up against the growing ecological crisis, and how those things are put in conflict with one another in a kind of artificial polarity. So the story really probes those questions about the ethics of protecting me and mine versus protecting the broader community, the broader environment, and dramatises how we misrecognise ourselves so often as somehow existing outside of our community or our systems of life, when in fact, of course, we are a dynamic, integrated part of it, and we are part of transforming that through our dynamic movement all the time. And COVID taught us that, if nothing else. But of course, those small fishing communities, they don't have to imagine the climate catastrophe, they're living it. And they have this traditional, deep understanding of small-scale sea fishing, which is in the main sustainable. But it's the industrial scale of overfishing that's destroying their livelihood and making them desperate and making them take bigger risks and plunder ever deeper waters. And in fact, it's incredibly dangerous for those communities. There was a researcher in Oxford who published in the BMJ who did a 20-year longitudinal study and worked out that more people die working on trawlers than in any other profession in the UK and Ireland. And that's a new thing. Are we out of time?
Nearly.
Okay, I'll hurry up. So the biggest themes, really, it's the conflict of reason and magical thinking. It's looking at myth and faith and parable as something that can be powerful and nourishing and unifying, but it can also, and can work in tandem with, engaging in a sustainable way with the ecosystem, but it can also be a form of self-soothing that prevents us from taking action. And I wanted to really address head-on this kind of undercurrent in Western thinking that articulates a rejection of scientific expertise, as if scientific expertise is somehow devoid of emotion or unsympathetic. And you see it across Western cultural product from things like Frankenstein and Metropolis onward. This notion of the cold scientist, or mad scientist, or cruel scientist, who's outside of normal human empathy. And so my central figure is this woman. I thought, okay, well, how do I address that? How do I contest that idea? So I gave her an intellectual difference. She's on the autism spectrum. So she struggles to communicate, she struggles to make empathic relationships with other people. And in some ways that fits with this cultural stereotype of the code scientist, but in other ways she's actually more empathetic in terms of her approach to what's really at stake. But what I wanted to do as well was to say that's not everybody. So this man, Ardalan Ismaili, this is a behind the scenes shot, plays a second scientist who's also on the boat. So she's a marine biologist and he is an engineer. And he presents a kind of corollary where he's warm and emotionally connected and also a talented scientist. But he's explicitly in the story, he's articulated as a Syrian refugee because it's important to identify those unspoken colonial resonances that form a backdrop to this story and a backdrop to the circumstances that inform this story. And then the other characters who kind of embody the themes are the married couple who own the boat, who engage in the pleasures of magical thinking as a form of community building and a poetic imagination. And you know, they form an argument in the story that magical and religious imagination can be a structuring force in terms of community building and in terms of creating sustainable work practices. But you know, in the contemporary world, the pain of economic pragmatism runs against those traditionally sustainable behaviours. So finally then I constructed this imaginary animal. The idea was to reflect and embody the unknown and the unexpected consequences of ecological breakdown. So it's circular and it's radial and it's non-mammalian and it has the colours of the globe in it when it's pulsing. And it's mute and it's powerful, but it's really vulnerable. And so it becomes this unknowable expression in life and of life, and like the biosphere, it's easily disturbed and it's delicate, but ultimately it's completely disinterested when it comes to the survival of any particular hominid species, so that it's perfectly able to adapt in a way that would condemn all of us to the fossil record. And so in terms of dreams and portents, that becomes the warning then that's at the centre of Sleepweaver's dream.
I'll call the panel to come back up now and sit. Is that all right?
I was going to go and sit.
Yes. Good. In your own time, Conor.
Okay, thanks. Can everyone hear me okay? Is the mic working here? Yeah?
I think pretty much.
Oh. Right. Great, just reinforcing stereotypes about arts and humanities there. Thanks so much for that talk. And also of the language of dreams stuff and the kind of German expressions and those chime in so much of what I've looked at myself. Thanks so much to Eve and to the Hub for inviting me to talk today. It's a real honour to be included in this panel. In terms of the topic, I'm also going to stay on the more kind of allegorical and abstract side of things. But I know then that Cathriona and Yairen are going to talk maybe a bit more specifically about particular landscapes and contexts. So hopefully we do have a good variety of approaches covered. And forgive me if I mostly read these remarks as well. I'm kind of not to be trusted to get to the point within 10 minutes otherwise. I'm actually very happy that this is taking place in the context of the Wasteland Centenary. As Eve mentioned, I'm just coming to the end of a PhD on the climate crisis in contemporary fiction. And one of the questions that's preoccupied me a lot in that research is to what extent any of the aesthetic techniques or forms I came across were really new. You know, public coverage of the climate crisis often emphasizes its radical newness. We've all become really accustomed to hearing things described as unprecedented or seeing temperature records broken every single year. Even this idea of the Anthropocene is really just an attempt to drive home to us just how recent and how fundamental a shift human-caused climate change is. And it is important to be reminded of those facts because, by rights, they should come as an absolute shock. But in much the same way that we as a society keep hearing this news and keep failing to be shocked into action, the contemporary fiction that I read about climate change seemed to be lacking that kind of shock of the new that's often ascribed to modernism in the 20th century and to poems like The Wasteland. So I thought I'd maybe use my 10 minutes to talk about some things that I think haven't changed so much in literature of this kind since Eliot's time, and other things that maybe have. I actually watched Sleepweaver just this week. I really enjoyed it, I really recommend it. And I was especially delighted to see the actor Owen Forey in there, because one of the pieces that came to mind first for me in this context was Marina Carr's play I Girl, which some of you might have had a chance to see when it premiered in the Abbey last year. I actually have to thank my colleague in the hub, Céline Dubois, for recommending that I go see it. I don't regret it. It's in quite a different genre than Eliot's poem, but in terms of the text, there are a lot of immediate similarities to The Wasteland. Eliot's working title for the poem was He Knew the Police in Different Voices, and the uncertainty of who's speaking at any given time in the poem is one of its most crucial modernist features. In I Girl, Faure also speaks in many different voices. Her character is listed only as girl in the script, who appears to be this kind of future androgynous, post-human figure after the extinction of Homo sapiens, so picking up nicely from the end of your talk, Neasa. She sometimes speaks as girl, but also as historical and classical figures like Joan of Arc, Oedipus, Antigone, and sometimes even in the voice of other extinct species like the Neanderthals. Like The Wasteland, I Girl seems to be set in this kind of desolate, barren space, almost outside of history. It also has this kind of heap of dust or sand on otherwise a mostly empty stage, and it's obsessed with death and destruction. One of the voices sounds like it might be that of the playwright herself, who's mourning the death of her father. One possible way of understanding Eliot's poem is to read it as the visions of the classical seer Tiresias, who announces himself in the third section, quote, I, Tiresias, old man with wrinkled dogs, perceived the scene and foretold the rest. And Girl also seems to be a kind of prophet having visions, speaking in the voice of old myths in an attempt to make sense of new extinctions. A lot of the scenes start with I, Girl, I, Oedipus, I, Neanderthal, and so on. Now, that all sounds very grandiose, and that definitely is one part of the puzzle. One aspect of The Wasteland that I think is as applicable today as ever before is the sense of perplexity, the sense that all this knowledge and baggage and complexity make it impossible to tell a clear or coherent story. And I think that's probably something you had to grapple with when making this movie. And I think the way Eliot's poem incorporates all this past literature and kind of implicates it in the shocks of the 20th century is significant, because the most important voices talking about the climate right now are the ones reminding us that the Anthropocene is actually nothing new at all. Writers and scholars like Dipesh Chakrabarti, Amitav Ghosh, and Robin Wall Kimmerer remind us that while the effects we're seeing may seem new, the causes and the paradigms underlying them go back to the very beginning of modernity and are completely inseparable from colonial history and the economic models of capitalism. That's a really important connection to me, and I think it'll be made a few times across the course of this panel. So while Eliot kind of fires the whole Western canon at us, it's important to bear in mind that the kind of way to get into that canon is a big part of the problem. But to be fair to Eliot, he's not just trying to rub our noses in his classical education. For instance, another feature that I think makes The Wasteland so compelling still are the hints of humour to be found throughout the text in these various different voices. Now, it's not a laugh a minute, as anyone who's read it will probably know. But the poem often does tread this fine line between humour and despair, such as in the conversation between two women in a pub, interspersed with this kind of scary apocalyptic announcement of closing time. Hurry up, please, it's time. Which you might actually have seen in big, scary letters on the hub window on your way in. I think it's one of the best things is being in that window. And it also makes for a really terrifying start to the day if your thesis is choosing. A lot of scholars have pointed out the importance of humour in writing about ecological themes, which might sound kind of counterintuitive in this context. Compared to these kind of prophet figures that we see with Eliot, theorists like Nicole Seymour have pointed out that a big part of the problem is this very perception of preachiness on the part of environmentalists, especially white Western environmentalists, or those of us in the sheltered global north, which I think you also touched upon with this idea of preaching to the choir. Seymour's argument is that while the issue at hand is deadly serious, the preachy tone is just associated with a lack of self-awareness, and it kind of turns people off this topic altogether. And she champions irony, satire, and play as ways to combat this. And while I think that maybe a version of that humour is there in The Wasteland, the form that it would take today has probably changed a lot. And that change partly has to do with identity as well, including the identity of the writers themselves. It's not a coincidence, I think, that I Girl wasn't written by a male playwright. Where Eliot gives us Tiresias as, quote, an old man with wrinkled female breasts, Faure is also deliberately costumed to look androgynous in I Girl. She wears this kind of armoured chest plate that leaves only her breasts exposed. And Cara riffs on this in the opening lines, poking fun at the discomfort a certain portion of the Abbey audience might feel with this. Where one of the voices in Eliot's poem laments, quote, "I can connect nothing with nothing," Faure intones at the very beginning of the play, "Breasts are like string theory, connected to everything, so obvious we have to deny them. Misogyny too. Poor men. Ah, the poor men. God love them." This type of humour, which could definitely be read as kind of female artists writing back to the fairly male brand of misanthropy found in the wasteland, is very prevalent in the fiction that I've looked at. And interestingly, it's often channeled through older female narrators, such as Janina Dusheko in Olga Tokarczuk's ecological thriller, Drive Your Plough Over the Bones of the Dead, which is also a great example of this question of how to kind of make these topics palatable and to kind of bypass the sort of defense mechanisms that audiences might have. And in trying to think about this type of narrator, I did come across one idea that I think is quite different from what's going on with Eliot. The idea comes from an essay by Ursula K. Le Guin that I really highly recommend. It's great. It's a short essay. It's called The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction. And Le Guin argues that our origin stories about the place of humans in the world have been wrong from the start. She presents the case that the first technology we came up with as a species probably wasn't a weapon, but a bag or a container. And for Le Guin, this idea that the first image of our humanity wouldn't be hunting, but gathering, allows her to feel fully human and to recognize the power of her type of fiction, as opposed to this whole masculine tradition shaped around the hero, which she sees as essentially destructive. There's a lot of humor in her approach as well. She says, for instance, that, quote, "It's clear that the hero does not look well in this bag. You put him in a bag and he looks like a rabbit, like a potato." But it strikes me that when Eliot's poem is so focused on destruction and fragmentation, this whole heap of broken images, that stories about trying to put things back together again, about trying to gather them up and take care of them in sort of unfussy, everyday ways, that those maybe do have a power to give us hope and to promote at least some, maybe quite ordinary kinds of action instead of despair, in a way that I think wasn't foreseen in Eliot's time. Okay, I can hear that voice now. Oh, great, please, it's time, so I'll stop there.
Thanks. Also thanks for the invite and for the timeliness of the theme with COP27 going on in Egypt right now. And it's interesting, I think, that the emphasis in Egypt is on climate Oh, sorry, did I not turn it on? Am I on now?
Yeah.
Could you hear what I said already? Yeah. A little. Will I start again?
Please start again.
Okay. I said thank you for the invite, and I did want to say that the timing is good for the Wasteland, 1922, and the 100 years anniversary, but also for COP27. And it's interesting, I think, that the main theme coming out of the discussions, at least the headline theme at the moment, is climate compensation. So compensation for loss and damage, which is really new. At least it's new. It's a new emphasis. In the past, the emphasis was on common but differentiated responsibilities. For example, every country had a responsibility. The rich countries had a greater one, but the emphasis still was on the responsibilities the developing countries had. Whereas now, I think the highlighting compensation and loss and damage is important. I want to frame my response to the theme in two ways. First, I want to say something about interpretations of wasteland, and we've heard some really interesting ones already. I'm not sure I can better those. They were really good in environmental ethics. So the way in which interpretation acts to make us understand environment and how to act in relation to it as well. And then secondly, to say something about narrative and literary approaches to climate change in contrast, and that contrast has already been made by some people tonight, to conceptual or natural science approaches, for both helping us to imagine outcomes and engendering responses, but also in in the gaps that it leaves in that way as well. So the first thing I want to say about wasteland is that for Eliot, of course, the term is used to describe land laid waste by human intervention, by human activity, interference, carelessness, acquisitiveness, all of those things. And he is talking about the brutal death of a generation, his own, and later the next. But he's also talking about sort of, and referring to some of the many disruptive, positive, what we call evidence-based initiatives that were going on in the world at the time, especially in Britain, in horticulture and in agriculture, that we would now call probably, nature-based farming or sustainable development. So initiatives in food production, but also in city building, like the garden city approach to planning. And of course, World War II was to disrupt that trajectory even more. And although I take your point that there's nothing new in the occurrence of wastelands, the truth is that we're currently involved in a great acceleration of those processes, which are, exceeding planetary boundaries, and that's a difference, I think, and we're in the middle of a sixth mass extinction that is human generated and is unprecedented in that way in the Earth's history. So this is especially so, I think, in the last 50 to 70 years, and that's what we call this period of the Great Acceleration, and now this new term, the Anthropocene, which you mentioned, where the Anthropocene meaning the world made over anew by humanity. So we used to be at the mercy of natural forces. Now we are changing the world in ways that are changing our life support system. The second, though, and also mentioned in different ways by both speakers already, is a more insidious meaning of wasteland. It's the narrow technocratic one that sees wastelands everywhere where a landscape has no obvious human use or function. So colonists and productionists interpreted, for example, dry savanna and flooded marshes as land to either be forested, regreened in some way, or drained for cultivation or for extraction. So the idea, for example, that arid lands are ruined, human-induced wastelands, led in some cases to dubious policies that damaged ecosystems further, many of which were inhabited sustainably by indigenous peoples who lived there for thousands of years, if not millennia. The assumption that land needs to be cultivated or indeed rewilded also depends much on how it's interpreted, and that needs more scrutiny. The rather awkwardly expressed SDG, you're familiar with the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, of land degradation neutrality, is intended to be a little bit better at describing ecosystems in non-loaded ways. It is in some ways a more responsive term and principle. Not unlike in the first principle of medical ethics, which is do no harm. First do no harm. So it has a sort of ecological version of that. So the objective is to support ecosystem functions and services and food security and protect natural capital from further degradation. It doesn't presuppose a specific ecosystem characteristic or future either, but pays attention to them. So the Irish theologian and geologist John Feehan often says to his students, we need to become slightly less inadequate in the way that we pay attention to the natural world. And one example of this approach to land degradation neutrality, again, an awkward term, through stalling certification, is that widely praised one of the Great Green Wall. Some of you may be familiar with the idea. It's an 8,000-kilometre long planting project in the Sahel region, south of the Sahara, which is about 13% midway. The idea behind it is to secure the soil, secure the ecosystem, and to secure livelihoods for millions. However, it also brings up new problems. And there's a degree of increased fencing going on across the world, and this is not new either. The fencing, of course, the enclosures happened in Europe in the 18th and 19th century, and later in the Americas. And what it is a continued privatization of the commons. It's creating new social and cultural tensions that can't easily be sidelined. And direct and indirect enclosure benefits mostly elites. And really, it's not shown the extent to which vulnerabilities are reduced by approaching it this way. So it can be misleading as a success story, subverting sort of the original objectives. The fencing can sort of subvert the original objectives. So in many ways, conservation and regeneration projects are more and more evaluated in terms of Ecosystem services, very useful. It's an extension on sort of bare utilitarianism or dominion, or high nature value farming, as well as considerations about habitat too for all species who also have a claim to belong in the ecosystem. But at the same time, the social ethics aspects are key, and capability building for sustainability has to be polycentric and multiple focus. So the land degradation neutrality approach is better, I think, at describing what's possible, but it also has its blind spots and needs to be part of capability building in development projects, and not imposed from the outside, for example. The second point I want to say something about is imagining climate catastrophe in literature and narratives of poems. And of course, narratives of climate catastrophe are not new. Nothing's new under the sun. And they're also often morality tales, of course, about blame and lament, about victims and perpetrators. They offer us visions of catastrophe, but also sometimes also more positive views, so utopian futures and possibilities. So the Book of Revelation, for example, people often mention the end times as the apocalypse in that negative sense. It's a prophetic biblical book of visions of the future. It does provide us with frightening images, but at the same time, the shining cosmopolis at the end times. So and in the meantime, of course, the idea is that we act towards that the eschaton is not about the future, it's more about the present, what people sometimes call proleptic eschatology. It tells us what we should do now. These are, all of these narratives, not just the biblical ones, are extra historical experiments in futures, possible futures, whether they're catastrophic or utopian or dreamlike or uneasy or uncanny. I think there's some lovely words to bring in. And they can often be considered more truthful than conceptual and scientific naturalisms because they engage our imagination, exactly because they engage our imagination. They allow us, for example, to see our kinship with nature and with others, and to also, in a moral sense, change our ways before it's too late. In the movie The Day After Tomorrow, which is considered a fictional account of Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth, we see a replay of the flood narrative and the end of the world, or the end of a world. Of course, the world will go on without us. Certainly, that's the thing, I think. This is not unlike the flood narratives in Genesis, although this time it's nature and not God who exacts a price for our transgressions. And in many ways, of course, flooding remains the challenge of many societies across the globe. But in the end, that story is one of heroes, and we've heard something about heroes already. It's only the rugged scientists alert to the dangers that survive. And ironically, it's the populations of the Northern Hemisphere that show hospitality to those, of the Southern Hemisphere who show hospitalities to those from the North, a verse of our usual tropes about migration. In some ways, this is a neat resolution, but this neat resolution is too catastrophic, too heroic, and too convenient in many ways. Everything is realigned in one fateful move. This can paralyze action, pro-environmental action, because the action that is needed to avert climate catastrophe is action of a different kind. The everyday working of painstaking international cooperation to secure LLDNs, food security, manage resources across borders, and to face climate change. Immersive experiences in art and in nature can transform our attitudes and thereby our behaviour, but we're always faced with this value-action gap, the gap between what we know is the right thing to do and our many competing desires for happiness, for life, for excitement. So we understand, for example, the contribution that aviation makes to climate change. We understand that less than 20%, or actually probably much less than 20% of the world's population has ever flown or maybe will fly, but we still want our holiday in Italy and a shopping trip to New York. This year at COP27, Climate Trace, which as it happens is an Al Gore Foundation, launched a list of the biggest single emitters of anthropogenic greenhouse gases based on satellite images around sensing, AI and collective data. Very interesting to look at what's listed. For Ireland, Dublin Airport is the biggest single point emitter, followed by cement manufacturers, 2 of them are named, car gas fields, and Dublin traffic. So the suggestion made is that, and has been made by Micheál Martin, is that our behaviour change has to involve some kind of voluntary austerity. So it's either carrot or stick, or maybe both at the same time. Imagining catastrophe can be paralysing and not pro-environmental. imagining voluntary austerity is a little bit like Garrett Hardin's mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon, can also be paralysing. But it is also possible to build on sustainable models that have been tested. There are good models out there that have been mainstreamed or could be mainstreamed at different scales. And scale is important, and I think that's why, yes, it's new, but the scale matters. That are also desirable, like cycling culture, nature-based farming approaches, circular economies for sustainable development, and justice, of course, for developing countries. And so sometimes it's the small things that make a difference, and I think that echoes with what you were saying already today. And I just want to point out this, which shocked me a little, because these are the small things that matter. And if we go on, you know, with our good intentions, but act against them, then there's a sort of, this is a perfect example of the value action gap. We value something, but we fail to act in relation to it, either because we're myopic a little, or because our desires for water and providing for our guests, which is a wonderful thing to do, of course, hospitality, has overridden that. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you. I really would like a glass of water.
I'm happy to go there. Great. Try to stand tall. So thank you very much to my fellow panelists, and even to all people in the hub for organizing this event, and thank you for being here. I would like to start by reading the first 4 lines of Eliot's poem, Island, and is the part that corresponds to the first part of the poem, The Burial of the Dead. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, steering dull roots with spring rain. And when I read this poem, and these lines in particular, I can't help reenacting it in my mind in the Caribbean, where a place I call home, as I call home Ireland, and a place where people do not need to imagine the climate crisis because they live in it, as in many other places of the globe. And in Eliot's poem, as in the Caribbean today, we have destruction and regeneration, death and life coexisting. Whereas in Eliot's poem, this contrast, this counterpoint is emphasized by the arrival of spring. I think that in the Caribbean is emphasized every day also by the still healthy and colorful ecosystems that thrive in conditions of extreme vulnerability. So in Eliot there's a clear reference to spring, and as you well know, in the Caribbean we cannot see the past of seasons in the same way. But we do have seasons. We have rainy season, we have dry seasons, we have hurricane season. And the impact of these seasons on people as part of the environments are increased by enduring environmental degradation, and vulnerability linked to long-standing colonization and histories of displacement and expropriation. And I think that's been already highlighted by my fellow panelists. So. And poets in the Caribbean, like Terry Walcott, Conor Brennan, Dulce Maria Loinas, in different languages, they have made sense of the relation between destruction, regeneration, and life, and resistance in the Caribbean in relation to other territories from Europe and Africa. And the work of many cultural theorists, like Homi Bhabha and Antonio Benitez Rojo, have been, in one hand, or to some extent, going back to those texts and gather the knowledge that emerges from creative practice and from creative writing and for that type of knowledge generation that is art. So in this sense, is that I am interested in approaching poetry not only as a form of communication or something we can use to convey the ideas generated in a lab or by engineers or natural scientists or even by cultural theories, but as a form of knowledge generation in itself, in its own right. No? And if you're interested in reading Caribbean poetry and knowing more voices, I think that anthologies are a great way, and there's a new one titled El mar no necesita ornamento, the sea needs no ornaments, and it's a bilingual English-Spanish anthology that I think that reflects these ideas of how poets are actually creating knowledge and inviting us to interact with others within the environment in a more sustainable way, in a more respectful way, in a more generative way. So, creative writing and poetry, as that can be approached, I believe, firmly as a form of knowledge generation, and that's why I combine my academic work with creative writing. And as many poets, I carry out research, write poetry, and I get research questions from poetry. I get new research themes and topics from poetry, and prompts from poetry, and ideas to collaborate with people who are able to answer questions I can't not answer. In this sense, I think that poetry can help us to face the climate crisis by understanding that, as Amitabh Ghosh has said, it's a crisis of representation and it's a crisis of the imagination. And the arts have that function of actually not letting the imagination down, but enticing it. This is why, I'm interested in the emotive dimension of poetry, and I understand that it can be used to communicate solutions to the climate crisis, or to counteract the negative impact of climate communications or failed climate communications. But at the same time, I'm quite aware that it is quite dangerous to instrumentalize poetry and the arts. So I think it's healthier and more productive to approach the arts and poetry as forms of knowledge making, forms of getting to know our role in the world better, and to assume it in a more generative, constructive, fruitful way. I have been lucky to receive the support of the alumni, Trinity alumni, and as Eve mentioned before, I published this book this year thanks to a Trinity Association and Trust grant. And actually, if you have a small project that needs support, I really encourage you to apply. We can all apply for it, students, staff, and it's a great way of putting forward, getting seed funding to accomplish projects that might find it challenging, to find funding. Fósiles de Lluvia, Fossilized Rain, is a book of poetry, of eco poetry, written between Cuba, Catalonia, and Ireland. And of course, it brings together the environments and the peoples of these territories. It brings together the Caribbean Sea, the Atlantic space, the Mediterranean, the Irish Sea, but also the bodies that moved and move between those territories. I'm going to read today a poem from this book, and another one from a new project that I'm in process of publishing. My poems have been very generously translated by poet Matthew Gieden, who has recently published a new collection titled The Cloud Architect. And I really encourage you to read that collection too, to read all sorts of poetry. And more poetry. I think that there are answers in poetry. So, una casa. I will read first in Spanish and then in English. Con esta tierra en la que ahogo las manos, podría construir una casa de losas frágiles. Durante el día la inundarían manantiales, mareas en las noches. Una casa para llevarla sobre el cuerpo y rehacerla cada tarde. Colocar la última losa en el suelo sobre el latido de las lombrices. House. With this earth in which I drown my hands, I could build a house on fragile tiles. Spring water would flood it during the day. The waves wash in at night. A house to wear it on the body and reconstruct every afternoon. Lay the last slab on the ground on the heartbeats of worms. And I'll read a second poem a little bit longer, Espejo. Antes de caer y hacerse un ovillo, el arrecife tiene dos caras como hoja de yagruma, envoltorio y contenido, negativo y positivo de la imagen, verde y gris, una mirada toda pencas, cielo, alguna nube sobre una capa de plata, una mirada toda agujeros, poros, canales sobre una plancha de vidrio. Huracán también mira de lejos con su único ojo, a veces suspira, se aleja. Huracán brama, irrumpe, baila en su templo con los brazos abiertos, es ritmo y cuchillas. Las esponjas de mar licuadas espesan la danza de aletas, pólipos, partículas, se vuelven células buscándose a tientas en la ronda para recomponerse. Todos giran, laten, se montan, escupen, se tocan, transmiten, convulsionan. Jazz de caja, bombo, toms, Goliath, plato, crash, right hat, se parten las baquetas, se revientan las cuerdas del violín, se rompe el vidrio, hierve la plata sobre los corales, arrancados de cuajo por el viento y las hojas. Los animales flotan a la deriva. Los animales flotan a la deriva, arrancados de cuajo por el viento y las olas. Se rompe el vidrio, hierve la plata sobre los corales. Se parten las baquetas, se revientan las cuerdas del violín. A jazz de caja, bombo, toms, Goliath, plato, crash, right, hi-hat. Todos giran, laten, se montan, escupen, se tocan, transmiten, convulsionan. Se vuelven células buscándose a tientas en la ronda para recomponerse. Las esponjas de mar licuadas espesan la danza de aletas, pólipos, partículas. Huracán brama, irrumpe, baila en su templo con los brazos abiertos, es ritmo y cuchillas. Huracán también mira de lejos con su único ojo, a veces suspira, se aleja. Una mirada toda pencas, cielo, alguna nube sobre una cama de plata, envoltorio y contenido, negativo y positivo de la imagen, verde y gris. El arrecife tiene dos caras, como hoja de yagruma antes de caer y hacerse un ovillo. Mirror. Before falling and curling up, the reef is two-faced, like a yagruma leaf. Wrapping and what's inside, negative and positive image, green and gray. A look, all leaves, sky, some cloud on a layer of silver. A look, all holes, pores, shuns on a glass plate. Hearken watches from afar with its one eye, sometimes sighs, walks away. Hearken roars, bursts, dances on his temple with open arms, rhythm, blades. Liquefied sea sponges thicken the dance of fins, polyps, particles. They become cells reaching to recompose each other in the round. I'll turn, beat, ride, speed, touch, transmit, convulse, to the jazz of snare, bass, drum, toms, Goliath, cymbals, crash, ride, hi-hats, The drumsticks snap, violin strings break, glass shatter, silver boils over coral, uprooted by wind and waves, animals drift. Animals drift, uprooted by wind and waves, glass shatter, silver boils over coral, the drumstick snaps, violin strings break to the jazz of snare, bass, drum, toms, Goliath, cymbals, crash, bright hi-hats, all turn, beat, right, speed, touch, transmit, convulse. They become cells reaching to recompose each other in the round. Liquefied sea sponges thicken the dance of fins, polyps, particles. Hurricane roars, bursts, dances in his temple with open arms, rhythm, blades. Hurricane watches from afar with its one eye. Sometimes sighs, walks away. All look, all holes, pores, channels on a glass plate. A look, all leaves, sky, some cloud on a layer of silver, wrapping and what's inside, negative and positive image, green and gray. The reef is two-faced, like a yagruma leaf before falling and curling up. Thank you.
Thank you, Yairen. What an absolute privilege to hear you read it and to read so beautifully in both languages. And my compliments to your translator as well. Just inspiring. We have some time for questions, comments, thoughts. I would ask you, if you have a question, raise your hand. Please, if you don't mind, you might say who you are. Please keep your question as economic as possible and obviously as polite as possible, but we'll see what happens anyway. But while people are gathering their thoughts and questions, I wonder, I mean, 10 minutes is so compromising for you all. Was there anything that any of you wanted to add or to ask each other, or that you feel you didn't get across as emphatically as you would like? That, strange feeling of completion. Good, I'm sure it'll come to you, but let's see if anyone in the audience has anything to ask. Any hands? Yes.
Yeah, I have one from our live stream to start. Claire asks, Claire says that the cutting edge of cli-fi is in independent publishing because traditional publishers refuse too much and take too long to publish. So she's wondering if there are any independent works that you've read or seen or would recommend.
So independent, either films, books, publications. Rob, the question has come in. I suppose this speaks to a larger agenda about responsibilities in our own work of every kind, to look beyond the capitalist trappings of the work we all do, and to try to push harder in our own working lives to get back to the local and to the grassroots that Cathriona was talking about. This is a tricky question, I suppose. I might start with you, Neasa, because you spoke, I think, very evocatively of the need to reach a mainstream audience and to use film and vehicles of film that speak to familiar genres, such as the thriller, for example, and yet to deal with a subject that doesn't necessarily appeal to the mainstream, that might lend itself more to the independent and minor formats that our questioner has alerted us to. I wonder if that was a tension in the way you approached Sea Fever?
I think that for me, the structures of the storytelling kind of forms that I was working with have tended to be used in a very particular kind of ways to deliver a very particular kind of thinking and imagining and messaging. And I guess for me the tension was, well, can we take those structures, can we take those, the abstract forms of, propulsive narrative drive, cause, will, by effect, and dynamic character transformation, but use them to make different kinds, to articulate different kinds of thinking, different kinds of imagining, And you know, I would firmly come down on the side of yes, it is possible. Of course, it's possible. You know, stories are one of the primary ways that we communicate ideas to one another. They're one of the primary ways that we manage to change each other's minds or articulate experiential perspectives that we might not personally have experienced, but that become very real for us through story. So I don't think that a story well told has any limits in terms of what's articulable.
Thank you. Anyone else want to come in on that? And I know we have a question in a minute. But Catriona, I was just wondering if you might want to comment a bit more. You mentioned the importance of storytelling, and that we've, as Conor was saying as well, these stories are not new to us. We've always had flood narratives, for example. But I wonder, do we see an evolution now that we're moving to a form of storytelling around the environment which is dramatically different? We don't have the survival story. We don't have the dove bringing the leaf. We don't have the hope at the end of it. We don't even have the promise of the survival of the species as sea fever, not to bring any spoilers into it, but there's a new pessimism. If there's nothing new, there's still a new pessimism, perhaps.
Okay, that's it. I think, yes, there's a lot of actually science narrative, which is science, conceptual science, instead of trying to convey ideas, you know, through the usual kind of analytic frameworks of data, tell stories too, because that appeals to people, then they can locate themselves in it, and sometimes that can be transformative. I think it's overstated though, because we also become immune to exposure to, you know, animals with big eyes that are endangered and small children who are starving. But, you know, so I think that, you know, film like Encounter in general has its place. So, you know, the sort of experiential can change us. It can also make us harder. So, you know, yes and no, I suppose, is the answer. And I think I'm neither a pessimist nor an optimist, and it's a kind of a funny road to go down. You know, we often say in gardening, you know, we're plant people. We plant things and keep going and hope for the best. It's a sort of, you know, so I think that, you know, we don't need a utopian story or an apocalypse to tell us what we can do in the everyday. And I think that's the real problem, is that we imagine that we'll all be suddenly transformed by a moral story or a piece of good art, it can happen. But that's not where the real changes are happening. They're happening at institutional level. People are working out really difficult treaties and arrangements and new arrangements and doing it again and again and again. So you know, I'd like to make that claim for a harder kind of ethics. You know.
Exactly. I think we have a question at the back, if I can get the microphone.
Hi, thank you all so much. That was brilliant. And I love the poetry readings at the end, just to echo what he was saying. I'm Orla, I'm doing my PhD here in the Hub. I have a question for Catriona, and then sort of a more general one for all of you, maybe. I suppose, just Catriona, because you maybe have the background in science and research in that area, like, I suppose I'm aware of this, like the sense that talking about the need to marry sort of questions of economic justice and, you know, like this idea of colonization with science and with the facts that we get about climate. I'm just wondering, like, is it fiddling while Rome burns to think about how sort of the science that we have now began life in the Cold War era, really, like, you know, out of a military industrial complex? Is that something that we should consider? Or certainly science in universities? And then I suppose, like, broadening that out to a question about knowledge in general for all of you, it struck me that that all of you sort of spoke about this this sort of gap maybe for the unknown, for what sort of goes beyond human understanding or rationality. So whether it's that creature from the very bottom of the, you know, the seabed, or in poetry, how, you know, there's space for imagination, and Conor, what you were saying, but also I suppose from the theological perspective of some element of faith, or the natural world being something, you know, transcendent. Like, how do we marry that sense that you all seem to see as necessary with climate justice, with science as, you know, an empirical sort of instrument, if that makes sense?
Thank you, Orla. Catriona, You first, and then we'll take that.
Well, it really depends what you mean by science. I mean, you mentioned empirical, of course, that's an element. I mean, science is about knowledge, and that's what it's about. And how do we know things? And poetry is, I think that's a really good point, is a source of knowledge. So how we know things and what we do with it, you mentioned a tool. It's, you know, we have tools, and the question is, do we use them appropriately? And this is a technological question. It's the application of science, I think, if you think of science as an abstract kind of blue sky thing. But how do we apply and use our technology? It depends on what's appropriate. Sometimes it's high tech, sometimes it's low tech. If the objective is sustainable development, which includes justice for everybody, then you're starting in a different place. Science is the tool that drives the sort of moral program. But the moral program, of course, involves not just raising people out of poverty and driving, you know, equality, but also sustaining the planet. And these are two very difficult things to do at the same time. And that's really where we're at. We have to do both of these things at the same time. And how science plays or is useful for that, it depends how you construct it, construe it, use it. There isn't a thing called science out there. It's people doing things and action and so on. The other thing about theology, of course, and we joked about this before we talked, you know, bad theology makes for bad practice, bad art makes for bad practice. You know, you know, it depends how you deploy it. And theology, anyway, talks about salvation not just in the world but beyond. So, of course, it can orientate people towards the world in the here and now as well. But that's not really addressing all of the things you raised. But I think, you know, we really have to sort of say more about what science is.
Could you define science as a methodology? Yeah. So, like the scientific method is
yes, you can. That's an empirical view.
Knowledge.
Yes, you can. Yeah. But that's the empirical. Yeah, I mean the social sciences see that differently. You know, they're not hard sciences. Like, you know, Ernest Rutherford said there's physics and all the rest is stamp collecting. No, so it's a kind of yes, exactly. So for some people, only physics is science. Everything else is a social science or
derivation of physics.
Or a derivation, well, yeah. Or a poor relation of physics. Yeah.
I suppose to pick up on the question, and I know we've got some more questions coming in, but you've got the problem of knowledge, and I was delighted with the confidence that Yairen expressed in poetry as knowledge generation, but you've also got the problem of the unknown and what isn't known about the future or about the way in which the natural world is evolving and reacting, and obviously Neasa, the film dramatises that in what is unknown becomes in the end ascendant. And I wonder, I mean, Conor, to bring you in on this as well, is this a realm where fiction has the upper hand? Because it's much better at addressing the unknown unknowns, I suppose, than science, which is deeply troubled by them. But fiction and literature more generally, and the imagination, have ways of registering the unknown that speak to us.
Definitely, yeah. I really like that soundbite about physics. I hadn't heard that before, and I think in the humanities we have that with philosophy a lot. Mm-hmm. Or actually, you were saying that yesterday after your talk, or yesterday I was speaking also about approaches to the non-human and kind of the impossibility of seeing things from a non-human perspective, which comes up a lot in the type of literature that I'm looking at. So one of the things I look at in my thesis is attempts to extend narrative omniscience, which is a big part of, you know, the novel, going back to animals and trees. Partly along you will have seen the big doorstopper novel, The Overstory by Richard Powers, which I don't really recommend reading, but you know, it tries to narrate from the perspective of trees. And I do think, I'm glad that this has been a panel of kind of skeptics and pragmatists. Like, it's sort of, I think, I'm really glad that it's been emphasized multiple times that literature shouldn't really be instrumentalized, or it just doesn't work anyway, that it can have effects, but often doesn't, and it's sort of hit and miss. And at any rate, that's not something you can study from within literary studies. I think that if it can be studied at all, then by other disciplines. So I think, like, if the physics is the kind of, everything else is stamp collecting, in philosophy you've got the kind of Wittgenstein, you know, like, about which we cannot speak, i.e. in logical terms. Mm-hmm. About that we must remain silent. And I think I like thinking of literature as the kind of practice that says, no, I'm not going to keep silent about anything. Like, it may be impossible to narrate from this perspective, but I'll give it a go anyway, and it kind of may always be limited and sort of messy, but it just kind of muddles through. I like thinking of fiction as something kind of weedy and not easily cultivated into particular forms. So yeah.
I'm going to come to Yairen on this point too if we get time. I think we had we've questions coming in now. Autumn, go ahead.
Hello, I just wanted to say before I ask my question, thank you all so much. This was the panel of my particular dream. So my research is in art science approaches to transforming our relationship with science. So looking at science and society and the role that art science approaches can play in that. And so each and every one of your contributions was so exciting, and I really, really particularly loved the poetry reading as well, and this idea of poetry and art as a way to generate knowledge in and of itself, and kind of displacing or decentering science as like the only reliable arbiter of truth, capital T, truth. And it does seem like we are having this kind of sociocultural shift within the culture of science. So I would argue actually that science is a tool, it is a method, but it's also a culture in and of itself. And it is going through this kind of paradigm shift at the minute, where we have to really face this idea of the God trick or the God delusion that Donna Haraway speaks about, that that science is something that is completely without bias, that it comes onto you almost like religion or like faith from on high, that it's something that beams down from somewhere, as opposed to having a center in a person or a culture or a place. And certainly there are things perhaps that science generates, like, I don't know, the speed of light, that maybe is a truth that we can rely on for now. And I think that's where we're headed, and this idea of like generative truth or pragmatism. I love what Conor said about this being a panel of skeptics and a panel of pragmatists. I think that's really, really great, and it gives me great hope for science as a culture. And I guess my question to all of you is, first off, I had to ask my wonderful colleague, because I couldn't remember who said it, but this idea of the sublime and how the sublime maybe plays into your work, the idea of power that is both compelling and terrifying, things that are so beautiful and so awe-inspiring that they frighten us. And is there a kind of appetite for that fear? And is it something that you see in perhaps all of your work? And then the other question I had was related to Neri Oxman's Krebs cycle of creativity. And she looks at these different ways of generating knowledge, whether it's through design or if it's through engineering or through art, but all of these different things that you're doing and learning kind of with your hands. So knowledge is something that is embodied within these different cultures. So I guess if you could speak to the sublime in your work, and perhaps this different idea of how you view knowledge being created, and if it's something that has become more dispersed.
Thank you, Autumn. And we'll pay tribute to Edmund Burke on the sublime, our own Edmund Burke. But I'm going to take another question, if you can get your thoughts ready on that one, just so we get. I've got Rita, gentleman at front. Shelby, you might come to first, because I know you've had your hand up for quite a while.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm a bit conflicted as well with the science area. Just as it happens at present, thinking about it. And just might be useful to say, like, I grew up on a small mixed farm, and where the nitrogen was fixed from the air from the clover, and there was crop rotation, and there was animal manure used, and so on and so forth. But there's the other side of that, as in with a little bit of poetry, is "O stony grey soil from Monaghan, the heart from my love you thieved. You took the gay child of my passion, and gave me your clod conceived." So it was hard work, in other words, and difficult. And also there was I think it was mentioned, there was the memory of the famine still there in the ruined houses, the deserted houses. And also when I suggested about making nettle soup, why would you be doing that with poverty food, and so on and so forth. But then is that at a certain stage, and this is where the science, of course there was science in that, in the fixing the nitrogen from the air with the clover and so on and so forth. But it's in the form of the agricultural instructor at the time, who is coming from like the state, the government. So it's expertise and encouragement to change that way, because you need to cash crop. You need to concentrate on one particular area of farming. You need to get rid of the hedgerows.
I'm going to just bring you to a question, if that would be all right.
Well, this is the difficulty which evolved then into greater as we went into at the time the EEC, and that is continuing, and it's coming up now to a very difficult choices and decisions for farmers in particular. And so, like, science, you could say, is a neutral thing, of course, knowledge, but nothing is, because it's how it's manifests and how the people that take certain knowledge for what reason and for what benefit. Like, I'm not suggesting that we go back to, you know, a very simple and sort of life, but there's inherent difficulties there, and I think it's reasonable, you know, to bring them to attention, or to try and deal with them.
Thank you. Excellent point. Well made. I'm going to Shelby back to Rita. We'll take one more question and then get some responses to this.
Thank you very much. I observed from our two artists in practice. My name is Rita, by the way, second year PhD in School of Linguistics. From our artists in practice, I noticed you posit the individuals to the nature world. Sort of, I noticed the relationship between the individual and the nature. It's very intriguing. I like the idea. And then I keep thinking about what is the relationship between the individual and the nature that we are talking about. And Cathriona was talking about in the global south, we sort of have the different idea about the perception of nature and the individual as what you are talking about in global north. So I'm interested in if it's after 17th century, after the empirical age, that we started to put ourselves, or we start to separate individuals from the nature, from the world. Or would you give me some of the ideas, some of the lead? Or if it's after modernism era, or whenever you would like to see people, individuals, started to integrate ourselves into the nature again. Thank you.
Thank you, Rita. So a collection of thoughts and comments there, and almost impossible to answer all of that or address all of it. But anything any of you would like to follow up on? Yairen, go ahead.
Yes, I'll try to address the three comments and questions more or less from my perspective. And I think that one of you mentioned, or traced the problem back to the Cold War. I think that many of us would agree that we can trace problem back to Enlightenment and to the moments of colonization, moments that converge, and the moment of the naturalism of the first colonizers and settlers, but then also the later naturalist writers of the 18th and the 19th century. And Humboldt, Alexander von Humboldt, who sometimes is called the second discoverer of the Americas, who I think had a poetic and a social sensibility to, within the limitations of his time and his role as his gender and his job, inventorying the Americas, making this inventory of the goods that could be exploited in the Americas, acknowledged that because of the lack of knowledge of the languages, the cultures, and the disregard and neglect of the knowledge of the peoples who were already there, previous naturalists had invented names for rivers that didn't exist, had created maps that reflected mountains that were never there. So even Humboldt was already aware of how non-scientific this scientific approach was. So I don't have an answer, a solution for that, but I think that maybe interdisciplinary research and relocating the human within science and relocating the way in which we look at others within the environment can help us counteract to some extent the damage we've caused and to rethink what is science. And I think that the humanities, the arts, can help STEM scientists to rethink what is science, and vice versa. I think that we in the arts and humanities and the social sciences have a lot to learn from other forms of empiricism, because there is a lot of empiricism in what we do, in the arts too, not only in the social sciences. So
again, beautifully put. We're way over time already, but would anyone else like to come in? Yes, go ahead.
Just briefly on a couple of things. All reality is mediated either through language or through models in the sciences. I mean, it's not, the sciences don't have a special sort of claimed truth. In fact, and theologians often avoid the word truth for good reasons. because we claim too much for our models and our perspectives. So that's the first thing. So whether it's through empirical ways of knowing or poetic ways of knowing, all our language and all of our models are limited. And you have to talk about the scope and limits of that. The second thing is, I think, there's a history of what counts as science and knowledge. And that shifts from the early period to, say, the medieval, where in the medieval people would say science was about wisdom. It became about knowledge and power later. And that, of course, is the experience of colonization as well, that it becomes an external power deciding what rivers you. We have an experience of our rivers being named and renamed by the colonists in Ireland, with this famous Brian Field play about translations and interpreting our world. And the other thing is that agriculture also has shifting models. And what's really important, I think, is the particular fit, that you have to pay attention to the knowledge that people who live in a place have, that is, like you were saying, the indigenous people, but also populations who know how to live in that place, who understand it. The problem with climate change is that it's shifting that knowledge and the way in which that knowledge can be used. So I'm not for a second giving science truth. Science is not truth in that sense. It's another model and language for mediating reality. And this is why I really think the point that poetry is also knowledge generating language is resonates with that entirely.
Thank you, Catriona. And that's, it's a place to bring this not to an end, but to a temporary stop, simply because we have to close the building. And I feel brutal. I know there are people who have questions and comments, and there's a great deal more to be said, obviously, on this topic. When we took the wasteland as our guiding theme, I didn't actually expect that all of you would read the poem and engage with it as beautifully as you have done and responded to it in the way you did. But it's been enormously productive and a real honour to listen to you all on this subject. Much more to be said, much more work to do, but I think at least this evening we made a start on this discussion. I want to thank the John Pollard Foundation for supporting Behind the Headlines. I want to thank the wonderful comms officer we have here in the hub, Rob McKenzie, for helping with the setup of this event. I want to thank everyone who's joined us this evening, all of you with us in the room, and many people who've joined us watching on the live stream. It's been great to have you back and to have Behind the Headlines back in action. And above all, of course, please join me in thanking our panel for their contributions. Thank you very much.